Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of season 3 of the web show Perspectives Live. This is a Colleges and Institutes Canada initiative where we talk about and share different perspectives on issues that matter to you. Today's episode is titled Taking Equity and Diversity to the Next Level. We'll look at the role that colleges and institutes have on addressing labor shortages while keeping equity, diversity, and inclusion top of mind. I'm your host, Manjula Salvaraja, and I wish to acknowledge that this episode of Perspectives Live is being produced and broadcast from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Now, before we get started, CICAN would like to thank the Government of Canada for its financial support of the program today as part of the 50/30 Challenge project, which is helping to strengthen the EDI capacity of CICAN members and the many communities that they serve. CICAN would also like to recognize the ongoing contributions of its corporate partners, BGIS, TD Insurance, and Scotiabank, who support CICAN's activities, including bringing you this show, Perspectives Live, in both English and French. Now, for those of you who watch us every month and who follow the show, you know that normally Denise Amiot, the CEO of CICAN, and I would normally introduce the topic, and we go back and forth about it and kind of get excited about what we're going to talk about. Unfortunately, Denise is unable to attend this month's episode. She's in Asia for a conference, but she has recorded the following statement about the show.
Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Amiot. I'm so sorry not to be joining you today, as Colleges and Institutes Canada's president and CEO. Hosting Perspective Live's episodes is a highlight for me. As you know, I really love the exchange of ideas, the exchange of perspectives that our guests bring, and this week's episode is no exception. However, I may not be able to be live with you today, but we have two of our distinguished member presidents who have accepted to participate to our show to represent the college and institute system, and they will share their perspectives as post-secondary leaders. The topic of today's show is a priority at Colleges and Institutes Canada. We are committed to working through an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to become a stronger ally in its strategic focus on advocacy, building capacity, and driving knowledge. Its commitment to ADI is not only an ethical and moral responsibility, but it is also necessary for sustainable pandemic recovery. We have an opportunity now as individuals and as a sector to address structural and systemic barriers to inclusion in ways that move beyond good intentions to action. I hope our excellent guests today will help us think outside the box, differently, wisely, and collectively about this topic and the solutions to address it. So without further delay, welcome to the show and enjoy.
Thank you, Denise. I know you're going to be watching this after the show. I'll just say you still have your great scarf game, even in Asia. I appreciate that. I'm trying to learn from you. It's not working for me so far. We are now joined by CICAN's past of Langara College. Now, Paula, hello. I think you seem to be muted. We'll see if we can figure that out really quick. I wanted to say welcome to the show. It's good to have you on. Can we hear you this time?
Hello. It's great to
Oh,
be
there. I
joining.
can. And you're in Asia
You
now.
can
What
hear me
what
now.
what are things like there? I can hear you. How are things
Thing,
like there?
it's very warm here, but we're having a great
Yes.
conference. And yeah, I've been able to interact with Denise today, but she had another commitment at the same time, believe it or not.
Yeah. Well, it's so good to have you on. As Denise mentioned in her introduction, this is a really critical topic for different parts, different institutions across Canada, certainly for colleges and institutes. Today, we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion within the labor market, specifically what it'll take to get there. Why don't we start by you telling us a little about the issue?
Sure. Yeah, I think we're all really happy to see some very positive things within our economy. Things are leveling off, hopefully a little bit more in the inflation, end to rate hikes in the interest rates. But one of the things that we certainly hear lots about in the college and institute sector and really everywhere is that there's still such a shortage of workers in the labor market. And we really applaud the government's effort to increase the number of skilled workers in Canada coming from other countries, working on projects like the 50/30 Challenge. But we do know that for many people, those coming from other countries as well as those domestically still face a great deal of discrimination, even before they get to the workplace. So we do know there are still some real challenges.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, you need to work to ensure the success of those. There's people that have a lot to offer and want to work, and then on this other hand, you have this need that you need to fulfill. Now, you mentioned that there are a number of initiatives and programs put in place by the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to
Mhm.
address this labor shortage, but also programs that are led by national and regional organizations like CICAN. Can you give us a quick picture of these?
Yeah, I can certainly talk a little bit about. I mean, certainly CICAN does so much to promote equal access for all in many different areas. I think CICAN as an organization is doing it within. They're supporting colleges and institutes to do it. Couple of programs that I can point to as specifics. One's called Skills Compass, which helps Indigenous and newcomer youth who are currently not in employment, education, or training to really develop the skills and career readiness they need to be able to go back to school and then prepare for a career. We also have a program at CICAN called the Pre-Apprenticeship Pathways Program, aimed really at increasing the participation of underrepresented groups in the skilled trades, such as women, Indigenous people, newcomers, people with disabilities, and particularly youth. Really putting a focus, I would say, on the underrepresented and supporting. And and more recently, I've been thinking a lot about sort of what does equity mean when it comes to education. And I think the supports that we provide to every learner are different, but those are the things that help provide that equal access and that equity.
Hmm. This is interesting that there are all of these programs. Denise has shared in previous episodes that one of the priorities of CICAN is to advance the SDGs, the United Nations
Yes.
Sustainable Development Goals. Um, and the initiatives you mentioned seem to be in line with that priority.
Yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals are a big part of what CICAN is promoting and I would say living. So everything that CICAN does, there is a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. I would say in this case specifically, we're talking about SDG number 5, which is gender equity, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And one of the things I can share is that even at the conference in Asia, this is a focus, is to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And my observation to Denise earlier tonight was to say just how far CICAN is in leading this work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. Thank you for sending that foundation for our first panel. We'll have you back in a little while for the second
Great.
part of the panel. We'll pull you back into the virtual table. Let's welcome our guest today. Joanna Goode is the Executive Director of the Canadian Association for Supported Employment. Meredith Preston McGee is the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism. And we were expecting Wendy Suk here, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute, and we're hoping that she'll join us very soon. Joanna, Meredith, it's so good to see you. I'm glad to have you here. I think both of your lines are muted as well. Let's just make sure that I can hear you okay.
Can you hear us now?
I can. And
You
I
can
think
hear me as
Meredith,
well?
can I hear you as well? Yes, because I think that it does make sense on a panel that we hear each other. Just try to get that right. It's wonderful to have you on. So let me start with this. I mean, if you look at the headlines a few years ago, everyone was writing about planning or launching some kind of an EDI initiative, and now when you look at the headlines, comments, and tweets, there's a lot of talk about failure, or a lot of talk about things not coming together, or people not seeing change happening fast enough. What happened? Who wants to take that?
I can chime in.
Joanna, do you want to try?
Sure. In our experience, working with and for people who experience disability, there's not a lack of awareness of the values generally, the skills and the talent that they bring to the workforce. But I do think many employers are unsure about how to tap into that labor market. And so we know that there is talent out there. We know there's a huge labor shortage. We know that potential employees who experience disability can fill that gap. But there is still lack of knowledge in how to bridge that gap.
Meredith.
If we look at the labor market, it really is a reflection writ large. And I think we're facing a stress test on a lot of these policies and procedures that we've developed with good intentions. I think Denise mentioned in her opening this idea of moving from good intentions to action, and that really feels like the moment that we're in. And so rather than saying these policies have failed us, to say those policies aren't getting us far enough. They've maybe helped us open a conversation, but it's clear that there's more that we now need to be doing. And so in a way of sort of learning from those quote unquote failures, to really try to find space where we can lean in maybe a bit more consequentially than we have so far with the policies that we've had up until now.
Joanna, I mean, you've heard the things that Meredith has pointed out here. What are we missing out on when equity deserving groups are underrepresented in the labor market?
Well, I can speak specifically to, based on what I've heard about the experiences of people with disabilities in Canada. In addition to the usual characteristics that we look for in strong employees, their education, their experience, they're both specific and transferable skills. We know that people with disabilities are often ahead of the pack in areas of innovation and creativity and problem solving, that they've developed these strengths that are essential to navigating the world day to day when they're repeatedly faced with barriers in the built environment and the systems. And out of necessity, many people who experience disability have really grown their skills in innovation and creative problem solving. And of course, those are the skills that we know businesses need right now in this rapidly changing landscape. So we're very much missing out on that particular talent that they bring to the workforce.
I like that you've taken it past just talking about inclusion and talked about the level of creativity or innovation that we're missing by not being inclusive. Meredith, the session has this title. It has the words "taking it to the next level." I've heard you call it the transformative stage. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, as the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, you'll be unsurprised if I bring pluralism as a concept into this conversation. But, when we think about pluralism in comparison to inclusion, we imagine that being a stage that's more transformative. Too often, I think inclusion is about bringing groups that have been previously excluded into systems and processes that already exist, that they had no hand in determining, in designing, and developing. And so what you're doing is bringing people, you're essentially asking someone to pull up, often a folding chair, to a table that has already been set. When I think about transformation, I think about us thinking differently about how we're engaging with diverse groups in the society in order to co-create new systems of how organizations are managed, how decisions are taken in an organization, how systems are structured. And I think that transformation is really the next stage that DEI, and whatever it will be called in the future, needs to undertake. And again, to your earlier question of why there might be discussions around failure, maybe it's because we're bumping up against this moment where we are required to be more transformative and to be more thoughtful about what kind of changes we're making as an organization, not to just get people through the door, but to work with different groups to enable a fundamental shift and change about how organizations are working.
I like that visual representation of the folding chair because there is this idea of a very sort of nomadic or temporary nature to that. Now, I am going to stop for a second to welcome Wendy Sukir, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me. And computer had different ideas, but
well, it's still good to, I know this is the thing. I was just talking about how even 3 years into this Zoom environment, our systems kind of don't want us to get together once in a while. So Wendy, we've been talking about bringing in equity deserving groups or working on those efforts to bring them into the workplace, and also in that way addressing the labor market shortages that we're experiencing. Let me ask you this, Wendy. We bring so many skilled immigrants to this country, but we still have a problem of them not getting the jobs that they've been trained for wherever they come from. They've spent years getting that education. They get here and they don't find themselves in those jobs. What are the barriers there?
so I think there's three things. One is policies. There's a real misalignment between the skills that count for points and the skills that are demanded in the labor market. So if you have a PhD in English literature, you get more points than if you're a electrician. So there's some real issues, I think, in terms of how we do that. I think the second that we know for sure is that there are often issues and processes, the Canadian sandwich, understanding cultural differences, making sure, people can score well on English exams and yet be challenged with some of the nuances with the language. So there's no question there's often need for skills, experience, and so on. But the real barriers are employers. We know if you have a foreign sounding last name, you're not going to get a call back, even if you were born in Canada, educated in Canada. We know that people tend to hire in their own image. We know that small, medium enterprises account for 90% of private sector employment in this country, and they're often very ill-equipped to deal with equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. In fact, with HR issues generally, in contrast with large corporations and so on. So it's really, I would argue, it's a systems problem, and we have to pick apart the different pieces. There's so much what I would call misalignment between what we say we want as a country, because we know there are a million unfilled jobs, as was mentioned, and we know that the boomers like me are retiring or dying. And so we know we need immigrants, but we're just not doing a very good job of lining the pieces up.
Is it also a matter of challenges when it comes to licensing or recognizing credentials?
Well, there's no
Are there
question.
barriers there as well, Wendy? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no question. And, we see it most acutely in things like healthcare, where on the one hand, that's what I mean about misalignment. On the one hand, you know, I don't know what you have to do to get a family doctor today. And on the other hand, we have doctors driving cabs or being retrained as personal support workers. If you contrast, for example, Canada to Australia across every occupational group, whether we're talking about engineers or healthcare professional or even just laborers, what you see is within 5 years in Australia, immigrants earn 90% of what someone who was born in Australia earns, and in Canada it's 50. So it's a combination of factors, and for sure the recognition of international credentials, and especially in regulated professions like nursing, engineering, law, and so on, are really, really problematic. We have doctors come to Canada as immigrants. They register in the United States, where they complete their medical license requirements, and then come back to Canada, because Canada will recognize a license from the US, and you can get it much, much faster than you can in Toronto. It's dysfunctional.
Mm. I, I hear all the time. I live in Toronto and I hear all the time about family doctor difficulties. And I think, well, that seems to be the obvious one. That story of we need a family doctor, but here's someone driving a cab. But I think that this is happening across other layers as well. Joanna, when we look back at how workplaces and work changed through the pandemic, there were some things that were positive, like valuing remote work. But are there ways in which the pandemic made the situation worse in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace?
Sure. And as you said, I think it was a little bit of a mixed blessing. We know that positives came out of the pandemic, such as an increased flexibility to remote work, because that is something that's really valuable for some people who experience disability. But it certainly created new challenges. So when the world seemed to shut down back in early 2020, we know that employees who experienced disability were often the first to be laid off and sometimes the last to be hired back into their positions. While remote work is often beneficial for a lot of people, it reduces barriers in the built environment. It adds some flexibility that's really beneficial for some people who experience disability. It can also be very, very isolating and doesn't work for everyone. And as many of us shift either temporarily or permanently to remote work, there are financial implications in terms of the cost associated with maintaining a dedicated workspace from home. And it also really increases our reliance on digital literacy skills, as an example, even for those positions where historically that would not have been a key consideration.
Hmm. So, what I'm seeing here is what I suspected the situation was, and I think that most people listening into this suspect the situation is: we have the people, um, we have a need, these people have the desire, we have the desire. What I'm trying to figure out is then where is the failure point here, and what is the way that we can address that, or even low-hanging fruit that we can use to address this? Is there a specific step in the process between recruitment, selection, organizational structure, policies, where the system breaks down, and where we can put some effort to see immediate results? Meredith, why don't I start with you on that? And then I'd love to get everyone else to weigh in as well. Where can we put where do you see the glaring problem, and where can we put put some effort into to see, change in the short term?
And I think there's probably several points of breakdown. I think Wendy's already just noted some of them around the mismatch of some of the policy framework. I would also say that when we think about organizations that are actually actively seeking to recruit equity-seeking groups, diverse groups in society, you have to think about it beyond just, well, we said we have these jobs, why didn't you walk through our door? But what are we projecting as organizations out there? Are or individuals feeling that these are spaces that they would want to work, want to be a part of. How are we projecting that? How are we explaining our organization? Are we using terms, for example, like Canadian experience? How are we valuing experience and knowledge in job advertisements and how we're putting things out there? We're very specific in our own organization that actually experience from abroad is in many cases more valuable to us than Canadian experience. And the idea of compartmentalizing those sends a message to people who are seeking employment. So I think language in those senses matters. But I would also say that it's beyond just the recruitment point, how you retain staff. How you're not just saying that we project these ideas, but how do we actually make these spaces, organizations that people feel that they belong? And when we think about belonging from a pluralist perspective, we think about it in three forms. One is, do people see me as somebody who is part of this organization? Do people see me as an active member of the organization? Do I feel that myself? And also, do I have agency in the direction that things are going? Do I feel like I am participating and not just an observer, not just a member in the proverbial folding chair? And so I think we have to think about those issues much more consequentially within the organizations, not just to bring people through the door, but to keep them.
Thank you, Meredith. Wendy, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's a shared responsibility. I have a couple of examples. Small medium enterprises right now are really struggling to recruit. And there was a company near Kingston that simply was not getting any applicants. When they got applicants, they were ghosted. People don't show up for interviews now. That's how hot the job market is. They made one change to their job advertisement. They said, internationally educated professionals welcome. And they doubled the pool that they got, and they ended up with much higher quality candidates. And so, businesses are about business. If they see an advantage, they will take it. And I think communicating those advantages is part of what we need to do. I think there's also a lot of room for innovation in programming. There's research that shows very clearly that a lot of the English language training programs that are government funded don't work. And in fact, people would learn English faster driving Uber than sitting in a classroom for 8 months. So we have to be prepared to tackle those identifiable problems and come up with really new and innovative solutions. And I'm a big fan, for instance, of workplace language training, because I think when people are working, depending on their circumstances, but very often, if people are given meaningful work, they feel much more part of society. It actually accelerates their belonging, even if we're big fans of entrepreneurship as experiential learning, not because newcomers have to own their own businesses, but it's a way of giving them something useful to do where they can learn about finance, they can learn language, they can learn how to interact with people. But we have to be prepared to look in the face at what works and what doesn't work. And there are way too many predatory training programs around, bridging programs that lead nowhere. The worst case, in my experience, seven Afghan doctors were told by a settlement agency, very well-known one, come, take this personal support worker program and you can go work for this home care agency and, that will help you on the path to being a physician. 7 doctors registered in this program. Just before they were supposed to finish, oh, sorry, the program didn't get accredited. There are no jobs. And this happens over and over and over with government money funding programs that exploit newcomer research that says the more educated the newcomers are, the less satisfied they are with any of the services that are provided, because someone comes with a master's degree from Pakistan and they're put in a program to stock shelves because that particular settlement agency has money to put people in programs to stock shelves. So we really have to tackle these problems in the system in a very intentional way and use evidence to invest in what works.
Joanna, I see you nodding along to that comment. Would you like to add something in here?
Sure. I think Wendy touched on something is that there are a wealth of services and supports and resources that exist to help employers diversify their workforce. And ensuring both that employers know about them and that they are evidence-based is really critical. Again, we know that many employers are committed to increasing the diversity of their workforce, but aren't necessarily sure how to get started. I think that this idea of, well, we opened the door, why are you not coming through, is really worth reflecting on, because sometimes we're opening the door to recruitment to empty rooms. Employers might have recruitment processes that are archaic, that are not reaching the people who are actually talented and available and excited to work. The example that always comes to mind is, as we rely increasingly on technology for our recruitment processes, not all of those processes, as an easy example, are compatible with screen readers. So if we're trying to be intentional about recruiting diversity into our workforces, but those potential employers have no way of even seeing the postings, we're stopping ourselves before we even get started. I think that Meredith's point earlier about, can I see myself as a potential employee in this company, is also worth spending a little bit more time with, particularly when we think about disability, recognizing, of course, that many disabilities are invisible, that as any potential employee, if I'm doing my research around a company that I might be interested in working for, I'm looking for specifically, can I see myself represented not just in the general staff pool of that company, but at a leadership level? And that's often, I think, where companies fall short, where different stratas of their staff contain different levels of diversity. And I can imagine that being a really large disincentive to certain applicants, regardless of the talent that they bring.
So then, this is interesting. No, go ahead. Finish your point, Joanna.
Oh, I was just going to add that I think throughout the recruitment and the promotion processes, we would be remiss not to recognize that there are misconceptions about disability, as an example, that are still prevalent, and that those unconscious bias, those processes that have been in place for a really long time that disadvantage particular groups, exist throughout, not through any ill intent, but only because we have a tendency to stick with processes and ways of doing things as we've always done them. And we're in a really a great spot right now, I think, to intentionally revisit our processes and our policies to make sure that we're not unintentionally excluding people.
Thank you, Joanna. Before I bring on our two other guests, Wendy, I'm going to get you to weigh in on this, and then I think we're going to come back to it. We've talked about the work that has to be done by employers. And I think that there's an understanding that the responsibility for creating that workplace that we want, with the diversity, the equity, and the inclusiveness, lies with the employer. What are some of the things that colleges and institutes can do to support and improve the situation? How can they help?
Well, again, I think the point I made earlier about being responsible when you say you're developing bridging programs, when you say you're developing programs targeting Black youth, making sure you're actually going to help them find employment, because we've done an evaluation of about 800 training programs, and we found this is not specific to colleges and institutes, of course. It's across the board. A lot of them don't have a strong enough relationship with the employers to actually know what skills are required and what competencies are needed. And it's especially a problem with some community agencies that wouldn't know a small medium enterprise if if they tripped over it. So really, anyone who's involved in training for employment needs to have very close relationships with employers, and colleges and institutes do that better than lots, certainly arguably better than universities. So that's one thing. Ensuring that the programming is appropriately designed, not just in terms of the pedagogy and making sure there's lots of flexibility and you recognize trauma and accessibility issues and so on and so forth, but also in terms of the content. I teach entrepreneurship courses with textbooks that don't have a single woman entrepreneur in them. You can search Google image and for carpenter, and you'll find Jesus, carpenter ants, and Karen Carpenter before you see a woman. So really, really tackling that whole notion that if you can't see it, you can't be it, and making sure that the instructors mirror the students and open doors. If you're a Black woman and the only people you've ever been taught by in a discipline are white men, that has real implications on your success. So
Yeah.
I think it's the entire process, top to bottom. We really have to, in my view, rethink post-secondary education and be a lot more intentional and a lot more responsible and transparent about what the outcomes are we're delivering. And again, colleges and institutes do it better than most, but there's still some gaps.
Well, on that note, and I just want to say that I'm okay with Karen Carpenter showing up in the results. I just want to put that on the table. So, having said that, I'd love to welcome two more people to the virtual table that we have here. Hello again to Paula Burns, the president and CEO of Langara College. Hi, Paula. And Jonathan Robb is the vice president of learner experience at Norquest College. Hello to you as well.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks for
okay,
welcoming me.
we have a lot that has been put out on the table. You just heard what Wendy gave you this great opening. She wants to see everything redone. She wants it all rebuilt. So, having said that, can I get both of you to reflect on all the wisdom that we've just heard from our first panel? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. No, it's great. This conversation is so important and so critical to who we aspire to be at Norquest College here in Edmonton, Alberta. I've just been reflecting on it, and I think a lot of the EDI efforts have really focused on individual behavior, and that's still important. But it does little to kind of address the systemic issues that exist and usually colonized structures. And so that's key. And I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on individual behavior, but I think we'd be remiss if that's the only way we tackled this topic. And it really requires a fundamental cultural shift as well. And for me, it starts with leaders. So every leader, I think, is responsible for creating, an environment where diverse teams are not only created and recruited to and assembled, but they can then thrive in the environments that they exist in, no matter where that is, no matter whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, post-secondary institutes, employers. And so really, I think incorporating EDI values, commitments, actions, are key within an organization's business strategy, but then making it real, actually right to the front line. That's when you're going to see the cultural shifts. And that's not going to happen overnight. I mean, everybody looks for, I've played in these spaces quite a bit and served in these spaces quite a bit, and everyone's looking for the magic bullet. And I can tell you in my experience, it's a never-ending journey. There is no penultimate that we achieve, and it's never ending. So whether it's looking at every policy and procedure in your organization and looking to deconstruct it, getting feedback from how marginalized groups see themselves within these policies and procedures, that's a starting point. But there's no magic bullet. So I just wanted to say that and maybe start there. I have a lot more, but that's I think that's what I'm hearing and deriving.
Paula.
Yeah, thank you. fascinating to hear what's being said by everybody. And Wendy, I hear your challenge loud and clear. I think as post-secondary institutions, we have a dual responsibility in that we're employers of large numbers of people in large numbers of communities, and we're educators. And so we have that dual role of making sure that we're following hiring practices that are supporting equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as creating education programs that match that. So maybe I can speak just briefly to my experience at Langara College. I've been there a little bit less than a year. It's a very diverse work and learning community that we have. We have students from over 100 different countries, and we do have English language programs, which we talk about are probably not meeting exactly the needs they need to. So I think your example of, does a newcomer to Canada learn English faster driving an Uber? Probably, and in a more effective way, which really speaks to work integrated learning and having those opportunities for all of our programs. I also have a background in healthcare, and when I think about internationally educated healthcare professionals, when I was an instructor, now like 20 years ago, that was a conversation about how do we actually assess their competencies quickly and move them into the workforce. It's discouraging that 20 years later we're still having the same conversation. But I can say that in BC, we are seeing some movement to assessment, not just in healthcare, but in other professions as well. How can we do assessment in a rapid fashion, really, to be able to get internationally educated professionals into the workforce, and so an effort towards that. But I do think that as educators, we need to look at ourselves absolutely, and what changes do we need to make in our programs, because we all know that if you change the way education is delivered, then it is going to change how people are able to interact in the workforce.
Paula, you mentioned this idea of assessments as being an area that you've seen a little bit of success, or you're seeing some change.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about success stories, or whether it's at your institution or something that you've seen somewhere else that you can draw inspiration and lessons from. Jonathan, Paula, could you share some success stories here? Oh, areas where you're seeing some change. I know that, Paula, you've already talked about assessments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jonathan?
Sure. I can. Yeah, I won't talk too much about assessments, but I think the intentional actions that I know we've taken at Norquest that have had some very, very good success is really the common theme among these examples, very concrete examples, is probably listening. I mean, I think that's where it starts, is listening and increasing awareness, and that's the foundational. For example, we really took equity, diversity, inclusion work to the next level when we wrote our, very intentionally, listened and then wrote our strategic plan, and it was very embedded. And so we had kind of skirted around this in previous strategic plans at Norquest College, but really the approach was rooted in, I think, listening to Norquesters, so faculty, staff, and learners, as well as employers, identifying what must be done to create meaningful, lasting change, sustainable change, not just flashes in the pan anymore. The work really focused on listening to how we might remove barriers, what barriers needed to be removed, and really just understanding specific needs of the communities we serve. And so I think that's the starting point. Since then, we've developed an EDI advisory council that was established in, I think, around summer 2020. And really that mandate was to provide insight on EDI work and really hold us accountable to what the strategic plan has said. And so, again, not just one-time listening campaign, it's that ongoing temperature check on how are we doing? How are you guys seeing yourselves? Whether you're representing and speaking maybe for a group with different abilities, or whether you're BIPOC. And so how are we doing? Are you seeing us move the needle? And is it happening fast enough? Or are there other barriers that have cropped up? Unintentional consequences often occur when you do this work. And so we need to be attuned of that. And then there's other, anti-racism working groups. We've just struck an anti-bullying harassment group as well, focusing on learners on campus. And so we've formalized, I think, not only listening bodies, but also decision-making bodies that are helping us hold us accountable. And I think that is really key. It's not a one and done conversation with this work. Like I say, it's really never ending. So
it's ongoing. Yeah. Paula, you've mentioned, I know that you've been at the school for a year, but you also have this huge network of colleges and institutes that you deal with. Is there anything promising out there that you'd like to share, that you've seen, that you like?
I think one of the things that I find an opportunity for us, and something that we're doing quite well at Langara, is even with our large number of international students, what I have found is that there's two things we do. One, as there are students, we give them plenty of opportunities to engage in some volunteer activities. And so we have a program that's called Volt, which is about students volunteering. Probably 90% of the students in that volunteer organization are international students. So they're getting experience interacting on campus, working together with different cultures, etc. But following from that, we also hire a lot of international students as employees at Langara. And so in my first several months there, I was amazed to hear the stories of the employees who said, yeah, I came to Canada 3 years ago. I was a student at Langara. Some of them come from professional backgrounds and do maybe a certificate, maybe a diploma, but they find their way into a welcoming environment and find meaningful work. And I think that's one of the real strengths of what we do at Langara College today.
So this is just a question. It's going to sound really silly, but I wanted to throw it out there because we're having this discussion, and because some of the work seems so sudden that people are trying to figure out, is this working? How can you assess if your plans are actually meaningful versus, people use the word performative sometimes to describe things, but how can you truly assess if your plans are meaningful? I throw that question to anyone who wants to raise a hand and answer it. And that could be for a school or even an employer. Jonathan, you're dying to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this just came up. I mean, it was just our last board meeting a couple of weeks ago where we were fortunate enough to engage students in a conversation with board members. And that's always a risk. And I think, I can't see others, but I'm thinking, it is risky because you never know what you're going to hear from students. And we don't want to script them entirely. And so we wanted kind of the good, bad, and ugly. But I think about particularly having a conversation at the table with board members that was a learner with accommodations. And this was their second time around, so second year in a row where they interacted with the board in this format. And what was very fascinating was, and unscripted, she said, I have seen the needle move. And she went on to give very concrete examples about how she gave some feedback about a year ago and she's seen the needle move. And so I think it goes back to listening, creating safe spaces and opportunities for those that are most impacted by these changes, and truly asking them and listening to them, are they seeing the needle move? And they're not, a lot of times people aren't expecting the needle to swing totally to the other side. They know that this takes time, this takes money often, this takes intentionality, this takes investment, right? And there's competing priorities often, right? But it was just refreshing to hear that she felt heard, she felt listened to, and she actually saw concrete changes that she gave examples of where I brought up this topic and I saw this action taken. I think once you get there and you just create those safe spaces to have those conversations, that's when you'll see, are you making a difference, right? And then keep it going, of course. Keep that momentum, keep that energy going. That's the key, right?
Good point, Jonathan. Would anyone else? Go ahead, Meredith.
If I may, Manjula, I think, Jonathan, several things you'd said before also really resonated with me on this question of this idea of not just listening, but acting, not just having listening spaces, but having decision-making spaces. I think that's particularly important. But I would also say, and it sort of reminded me, Manjula, in your first question about this narrative around failure of DEI initiatives. And I always think failure is a bit of a dangerous term because often things have worked only to a point and they need to be adjusted. And so if that student in Jonathan, in your example, had said, I've seen the needle move, but this is what needs to happen now, you may need to change your policies. They may need to evolve. You may need to recognize that you've made a mistake and walk something back and go forward. And we need these spaces where people are able to do that. And I think safe spaces is a term that gets used a lot. One of the terms we like to use at the Global Center is brave spaces. So spaces where you can actually be brave about failure, making a mistake, stepping back from something, and trusting that the relationships that you've built will enable you to recover from a mistake that's being made and then move something forward. I think that's really key in terms of ensuring that things aren't just for show, aren't just performative, but are really embedded in the culture of an organization.
I like that. Brave spaces. Yeah, I really like that term.
Me too.
So I'll just, we came into this discussion. I think I asked all of you for low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, Wendy had to say we've got to take it all apart and restart or at least change a lot of things. So let me ask you this, whoever wants to answer this. This is akin to moving a really big ship. No matter how you see it, it is akin to moving a really big ship. Are we expecting too much, too fast, or is this all just ridiculously too slow? Joanna, you shook your head, so you get to go first.
Yeah, I think both exist. That this is a really big ship and it's not going to change overnight. And yet, I think we've already heard some examples of individuals and organizations stepping forward in an authentic way to bring about these changes. You mentioned earlier, Jonathan, that this can't just be about change that happens on a personal level. It has to exist at an interpersonal and a systemic level as well. And so I would really reinforce that. I do think that there are a wealth of resources that do exist around how do we increase the diversity of our institutions, our organizations, our companies. And so being able to know about those and take advantage of those is important. I know for the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, the other piece that's on our mind is how are there opportunities for companies and for organizations to take whatever the next step is for them on that journey. That we know sometimes people recognize EDI is important. It's a commitment that they've made at a high level, but aren't really sure how to make those changes in practice. And so finding where those opportunities are to make small changes, to be willing to fail and have that strength of relationship, as you said, Wendy, to keep on that journey, even though we don't necessarily know what our 10th step is going to be. That commitment to the commitment to trying, even though we know we'll likely make mistakes, and even though we know we can't do it ourselves, there needs to be input and wisdom and collaboration from the ground up at every step of the journey.
Wendy, any thoughts on that? Too fast, too slow, somewhere in the middle? All of everything?
I've been doing this a long time, so depends on what side of the bed I get up on. I've worked on women in technology for 33 years, and there are fewer women in computer science today and only marginally more in engineering than there were when I started. So abject failure in some areas, but definitely progress in others. I think, and if we reflect on why all the good intentions around women in technology have really not moved, I would say there are lessons there. And for me, the lessons are that systems perspective. So you actually understand what matters and where the levers are. I'm a big believer in targets and accountability. And while representation is not the only thing, it's a big thing. And, what gets measured gets done, whether you're talking about representation overall, whether you're talking about leadership, whether you're talking about student representation, whether you're talking about how you spend your procurement dollars. I think those things are really important. I also think we've got to stop thinking about an EDI strategy as a bolt-on to corporate strategy or organizational strategy. Whether you're a hospital, a university, or a nonprofit or Starbucks, you got a strategy. And in my view, and the approach we take with the diversity assessment tool is every element of your organizational strategy has to have an EDI lens applied to it. So you look at representation and governance and policies. You look at HR, of course, that's important. You look at culture, but you also look at your value chain. You look at procurement. You look at how you design the services that you're offering. You look at how you're supporting your clients, customers, students, whatever they are, and who's being left behind. You look at who you partner with. You look at where your philanthropic dollars go. In my view, the best EDI strategy is one that's just embedded from top to bottom, and we have to invest upstream. I mean, Mohammed Elmi, who's my executive director, said, we can't change who's in the boardroom if we don't change what happens in the classroom. And so that kind of systems perspective, I think, is really important. But, just to echo what was said, there's a lot of good intention. There are a lot of training programs. Training is the least effective way to change behavior. I know if I eat too much and I don't exercise, I'd be fat. But that has no impact, And so thinking about what actually does change behavior is really, really important. And, post-secondary institutions chase money, business chase money. Those stakeholder priorities can really make a big difference. So I do think that you need a combination of bottom-up and top-down approaches.
Well, that's a great note, Wendy. Thank you. That's a great note to end this discussion on. Thank you all. As always, we invite you to share your perspectives and questions and comments on today's discussion using the email address that is appearing on your screen. And to stay on top of the latest developments in Canada's college sector, don't forget to visit CICAN's news center, where you can also subscribe to Perspectives, the free biweekly electronic newsletter. I am very grateful to everyone who joined us at the virtual table today. Paula Burns, President and CEO of Langara College; Jonathan Robb, Vice President, Learner Experience at Norquest College; Joanna Goode, Executive Director of the Canadian Association for Supported Employment; Meredith Preston McGee, Secretary General at the Global Center for Pluralism; and Wendy Sukir, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute. And in closing, I invite you to join us on May 17th for the 5th episode of Perspectives Live, which will focus on artificial intelligence and how colleges and institutes can use it to their advantage, and above all, to the benefit of learners, including the advent of ChatGPT. You knew we were going to have a show on this, on ChatGPT. So there it is. Circle that date off. It's on May the 17th. I invite you to visit the Perspectives Live webpage, where you can watch or rewatch this episode and all of our past episodes. My name's Manjula Selvarajah. It's been my pleasure to be your host. Thank you for joining us, and take care.